Picture yourself inside a marble chamber thick with steam and the sickly sweetness of imported oils. You are close enough to hear the breathing of the most dangerous man alive. For a decade, you have filled his golden goblet, smiled when he smiled, and kept your face perfectly still every time he waved a hand and ended someone's life. His name is Commodus, Emperor of Rome. And right now, just beyond a curtain of vapor, he is soaking in his private bath, completely relaxed, completely unaware. Minutes ago, you found something you were never supposed to find. A small tablet tucked beneath a pile of letters, covered in neat handwriting. It is a kill list, names scratched into wax, each one paired with a method of execution. You scan the column, and your stomach drops. Your own name stares back at you, scheduled for sunrise. You are Marcia, lover, confidant, the one woman he trusts above all others. And now, you have maybe 60 minutes before the most powerful man on earth steps out of that water, dries his hands, and signs your death warrant. Beyond the palace walls, the city buzzes with celebration. Rome is counting down to a brand new year. But if Commodus walks out of that bath breathing, you will never feel daylight again. Not on January 1st, 193 AD. Not ever. You have seen what he does to people who disappoint him. The iron hooks, the public spectacle, the slow, deliberate humiliation designed to make an example of anyone who dares defy a living God. But standing here now, heart pounding against your ribs, you realize something. This is bigger than saving your own skin. For over a decade, this man has hollowed out the greatest civilization on the planet. He has bled its treasury dry, poisoned its military, and turned its arenas into slaughterhouses for his own entertainment. How does a woman with no army, no title, and no political power end up standing in a dark hallway holding the fate of an empire in her hands? To answer that, we need to rewind. We need to walk through every twisted chapter that brought Rome to its knees and Commodus to this bathtub. Forget the polished Hollywood version. Forget the brooding prince from the movies. The real Commodus was something far worse. Not just a tyrant, a predator, a man who treated human beings like playthings and genuinely believed the gods had chosen him to do it. Tonight, we trace the entire arc, from a boy raised in gold to the monster soaking behind that wall, through fire and sand and feasts soaked in blood, all the way to the moment Marcia finally decides. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what city and country you are watching from right now. And if you have not subscribed yet, take 1 second to do it. This is ancestral, and nobody tells dark history like we do. To grasp what happened in that steam-filled room, you need to go back more than 2 decades, to a cold morning when a small boy woke up surrounded by silk and believed the entire world existed to serve him. Commodus was not some general's son raised in a border town. He was born inside the imperial palace itself, the child of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor history would later call the philosopher king. From his very first cry, an army of servants materialized around him. Nurses, guards, teachers, entertainers, slaves, whose only purpose was to keep this one child comfortable, fed, and never bored. No boy in Roman history had ever been so shielded from reality. He was not the only child. Marcus Aurelius and his wife Faustina buried several sons and daughters before they reached adulthood, the way so many Roman parents did. Every tiny coffin broke the emperor a little more, and every child who survived became something almost sacred. Commodus had entered the world as a twin, But his brother did not last long. That left him carrying a double weight on his small shoulders. He was the cherished heir, and the living reminder that fate could snatch everything away without warning. Marcus poured resources into shaping the boy. Philosophers, military veterans, masters of rhetoric, all paraded through his rooms day after day, filling his head with history, ethics, and the mechanics of command. On parchment, the plan looked flawless. This child had every advantage a future emperor could ask for. But something inside him rejected all of it. His tutors noticed early. Where other children recoiled at suffering, Commodus leaned in. A wounded animal did not make him cry. It made him curious. He wanted to know how long the thing would last. When a household slave fumbled and broke something, he did not pout the way children do. He demanded consequences, real ones. The palace staff traded nervous glances and told each other that his temper burned hot and faded quickly. But underneath those outbursts sat something colder than anger. Something that made even battle-scarred veterans uneasy. The moment that turned whispers into genuine fear came when Commodus was roughly 11. He had spent the entire day performing the role of a young prince, reciting prepared speeches, studying troop formations scratched into wax, sitting through another grinding lecture about virtue and duty. All he wanted now was his bath. For a Roman aristocrat, bathing was not a chore. It was ritual. Steam, scented oils, the careful scraping of the skin, and above all, water heated to exactly the right temperature. Commodus walked in expecting perfection. What he got was lukewarm water. Maybe the furnace had not been stoked properly. Maybe someone miscounted the minutes. Whatever the reason, the water was too cool, and the boy did not simply complain. He erupted. His voice bounced off the tiled walls as he screamed for whoever was responsible. Faces appeared in the doorway, drained of color. The furnace attendant, a man caked in soot and exhausted from feeding logs into the fire since dawn, was hauled before the prince. In any ordinary household, a child's tantrum would earn a scolding and be forgotten by dinner. But inside the imperial palace, the words of the heir carried the force of law. Commodus pointed at the shaking man and declared that he should be thrown into the furnace and burned alive. Not beaten, not reassigned. Burned. The adults in the room felt their insides go cold. This was not a child playing pretend. An order from the imperial bloodline, even from a boy, had real teeth. Nobody wanted to find out what would happen if they refused. So the attendants stalled. They bowed, praised the prince's sense of justice, and marched the furnace worker out of sight. Then, desperate to save the man's life without openly defying the boy, they improvised. They brought Commodus to the furnace chamber, shielded his view just enough, and hurled bundles of raw wool drenched in animal fat into the flames. The grease ignited with a thick, stomach-turning stench. Smoke billowed. One of the attendants let out a convincing scream of agony. Commodus stood there, breathing in the reek of burning fat, and believed he had watched a man die on his command. He did not tremble. He did not turn away. He did not ask a single question about whether the punishment matched the offense. He simply accepted that a lukewarm bath had been corrected by a human bonfire and walked back to his evening as though he had swatted an insect. That absence of feeling horrified the palace staff far more than any burst of rage ever could. Rome had seen angry emperors and paranoid emperors. It had not seen a child look at a supposed execution the way someone looks at a fixed leak. The secret might have stayed buried inside those walls. But in a palace crawling with servants, nothing stays hidden forever. At some point, Commodus discovered the truth. Maybe a guard drank too much and let it slip. Maybe a terrified slave confessed under pressure. However it happened, the boy learned that no one had actually burned, and his reaction told you everything you needed to know about what was growing inside him. He was not embarrassed. He did not laugh it off. He did not feel an ounce of relief that a life had been spared. He ordered the furnace worker killed for real and then turned his anger on the men who had dared to trick him. Marcus Aurelius, fighting Germanic tribes along the frozen banks of the Danube, eventually heard the story. For a man who spent his private hours writing about mercy, self-discipline, and the fragility of life, this was devastating. He had already worried that the comforts of the palace were making his son soft. Now he confronted something far worse. Not softness, emptiness. A void where compassion was supposed to live. He still loved the boy. He still believed he could steer him. But the furnace story rippled through the court like poison, and everyone who heard it understood the same thing. The future emperor of Rome did not merely lack restraint. He lacked the ability to feel for another human being. Marcus responded the only way he knew how. He pulled Commodus out of the marble cocoon and dragged him to the frontier, into the camps where Roman legions bled and froze fighting barbarian warbands. The idea was simple: show the boy real suffering. Let him see mud and disease and men missing limbs. Let him stand before soldiers who had sacrificed everything for the eagle standard and understand that ruling meant carrying the weight of other people's lives. Marcus wanted hardship to crack open something human inside his son. Commodus absorbed a completely different lesson. He discovered that even as a teenager, armed men dropped to their knees when he appeared. He realized that the same voice that had once commanded a single slave could move entire legions. He loved the salutes, the rigid formations, the crash of armor, as thousands of soldiers acknowledged his presence. The lectures about sacrifice and duty rolled right off him. The raw feeling of dominance soaked in. He enjoyed barking orders at grizzled veterans and watching them scramble. For Marcus, the frontier was a classroom. For Commodus, it was a taste of unlimited power. Late at night in those campaign tents, Marcus sat alone and wrote the reflections that the world would eventually know as the Meditations. He told himself to be patient, to accept what the universe placed in front of him, to love his son as he was, not as he wished him to be. But the gap between the boy and the philosopher's dream kept widening. Commodus had no interest in abstract virtue. He wanted wrestling matches and wild animal hunts. When his father's advisors tried to correct him, he either tuned them out or mocked them the moment they turned their backs. Marcus still refused to give up. He elevated Commodus to co-emperor while the boy was barely old enough to shave, hoping that the gravity of shared power would force maturity. He brought him into Senate sessions where gray-haired men debated taxation and border policy. He seated him at diplomatic receptions for foreign kings. Every move was designed to say the same thing: you are the future. Learn to carry it. But behind the polite nod and the practiced smile, Marcus could feel his son's restlessness. Commodus wanted the throne, not the responsibilities that came with it. The glory, not the grind. When Marcus Aurelius finally died in the spring of AD 180, somewhere near the Danube, the empire did not collapse. It simply changed hands. Overnight, a 19-year-old who had never been told no in his life became the sole master of a dominion stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the Egyptian desert. The Senate hoped that seasoned advisors would keep him in check. The people hoped the philosopher's son would govern with wisdom. The army hoped he would be generous and strong. None of them fully understood the kind of man who had just wrapped his fingers around the most powerful office on earth. At first, he did something that looked almost merciful. He abandoned the brutal, grinding wars along the northern border and headed straight back to Rome. Plenty of citizens were exhausted by years of fighting. Peace sounded wonderful. But Commodus did not end the campaign out of compassion for the dying. He ended it because the frontier was uncomfortable. He wanted heated marble under his feet, not frozen mud. He wanted perfumed baths, not canvas tents. He let his generals sign treaties his father would have torn apart, all so he could get home faster. Once inside Rome, Commodus walked into a system designed to consume every hour of an emperor's day. Petitions from citizens, judicial hearings, provincial reports, treasury summaries, letters from governors begging for guidance. He glanced at the mountain of obligations and pushed nearly all of it onto his inner circle. Why endure tedious Senate debates when he could lounge with performers and companions? Why squint at financial records when there were chariot races and private spectacles to enjoy? Let the bureaucrats and prefects worry about the machinery. He would enjoy the throne. If that had been the whole story, history might have filed him away as just another indulgent emperor. Disappointing, but not unique. Rome had survived lazy rulers before. What twisted his reign into something genuinely monstrous was not the laziness itself. It was the way all those empty, unchallenged hours inflated his sense of self. Surrounded every waking moment by courtiers who needed his favor to keep their wealth and their heads, Commodus started believing the flattery. They did not just tell him he was powerful. They told him he was chosen, anointed, favored by the heavens in a way no Roman leader had ever been. And that is where the obsession with godhood took root. Previous emperors had been deified after death, given temples and offerings as a formality. A few had flirted with divine status while still breathing. Commodus did not want subtle hints. He wanted outright worship. He latched onto the myth of Hercules, the legendary strongman who strangled beasts and conquered monsters with nothing but muscle and a wooden club. Commodus looked at that figure and saw himself staring back. Invincible, savage, beyond mortal limits. He started appearing before the public draped in a lion's skin, bare-chested, gripping an enormous club as though he had just walked out of the myth himself. Imperial coins were minted, showing not an emperor, but Hercules Romanus, the Roman Hercules, fusing the state with legend. Sculptors carved statues blending his face with the hero's body. To question any of it was to challenge a god, and challenging a god meant death. But symbols alone could not satisfy him. Commodus ordered the colossal statue that stood near the amphitheater, the towering bronze figure originally associated with Nero, to be remodeled. Workers removed the old head and replaced it with his own likeness, crowned with the rays of the sun. Citizens who had spent their entire lives passing one face on that monument now had to look up every single day and see Commodus gazing down at them, his shadow stretching across the arena and into the streets like the arm of a god reaching over the city. He did not stop at statues. The calendar itself was rewritten. Months that had carried their names since the founding of Rome were stripped and rechristened with his titles, turning the passage of time into an endless repetition of his identity. He toyed with renaming Rome itself, rebranding the eternal city as Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. Legions, grain fleets, official records, all were stamped with variations of his name until every document, every ship, every formation echoed the same message. Everything exists because of me. Everything belongs to me. Inside the palace, this delusion infected every interaction. Courtiers competed to outdo each other with increasingly absurd praise. Poets declared him the new sun rising over civilization. Priests wove his supposed divinity into sacred rituals. Anyone who hesitated, anyone whose smile flickered for even a heartbeat, became a target. If you lived within reach of Commodus, you mastered one skill above all others. You agreed. You nodded. You declared that he was Hercules reborn, that no ruler in history could compare, that his strength was beyond human measurement. Even if the words made your stomach turn, you said them. Because the only alternative was an execution order with your name on it. But for Commodus, even the worship started to feel hollow. Being told he was a god was no longer enough. He did not just want to hear about his own power. He wanted to feel it, to perform it in front of thousands of witnesses who could not look away. And in Rome, there was only one stage grand enough for that kind of spectacle: the arena. Before we step onto that blood-soaked sand and into the horrors that followed, let me ask you something. If this story has its hooks in you, if you can feel the dread building as you watch this air spiral deeper into madness, then you might belong in our inner circle. We call it the lineage. It is not just a membership. It is a statement that you are part of a community that refuses to let the darkest chapters of history be sanitized or forgotten. Members are the backbone of everything we do here. You get early access to new episodes, behind-the-scenes content we never release publicly, and you help us keep producing these investigations without compromise. If something in your gut tells you this is where you belong, check out The Lineage and stand with us. Because for Commodus, the temples and the titles and the renamed months had stopped feeding the hunger. He needed to physically demonstrate his godhood. He needed a stage where the roar of tens of thousands would drown out any last whisper of doubt. And he found it right in the center of Rome, inside the immense stone amphitheater the world would come to know as the Colosseum. He was convinced that once he stepped onto that sand, he would not simply rule. He would prove, in front of every eye in the empire, that he was something more than human. What he did inside those walls would drag Rome into a nightmare that made even the darkest fears of his father look like a gentle warning. He had already rewritten reality to cast himself as a god. Now he was about to force an entire civilization to live inside his fantasy, whether they chose to or not. And the cost of that fantasy would be measured in human blood. When being worshipped on parchment and in marble stopped feeding the hunger, Commodus went looking for the one place in Rome where no one could close their eyes. The amphitheater, the building the world now calls the Colosseum, had served emperors for generations as a tool of public control. Free grain, exotic animals, staged combat, all designed to keep the masses loyal and distracted. But every emperor before him had ruled the games from a distance, watching from the imperial balcony like a patron overseeing his investment. Commodus had no interest in watching. He intended to be the spectacle. At first, the rumors were almost too bizarre to believe. Word leaked that the emperor had been fighting as a gladiator behind closed doors, inside private training grounds where no citizen could witness the shame. Gladiators occupied one of the lowest rungs of Roman society. They were slaves, condemned criminals, or men so desperate they had sold their own freedom for a meal. For the most powerful man in the known world to pick up their weapons and imitate their trade was an insult to every institution the empire had built. Senior senators grumbled that it degraded the office of emperor itself. Commodus did not care. He loved the weight of a blade in his fist and the fantasy of a crowd screaming his name. Then he stopped hiding. He announced that he would fight publicly. not as the dignified ruler presiding over the entertainment, but as a competitor stepping onto the sand. Announcements circulated through the city. The population could barely process what they were hearing. Yet when the day arrived, there he stood. Commodus, wrapped in the costume of Hercules, feet planted on blood-stained ground, while tens of thousands of Romans held their breath. The senators sat rigid in their front-row seats, faces drained of color, knowing that if anything went sideways, their necks would be the first on the block. None of it was real combat. Commodus never once risked his life. Every opponent who entered the arena against him had been hand-picked and hobbled. Some were chained so they could barely move. Others carried training swords made of wood, useless against his real armor. A few had been drugged beforehand, stumbling into the sand half-conscious. When he hunted wild animals, he did it from elevated platforms or behind heavy barriers, firing arrows from a safe distance where no claw or tooth could reach him. There was zero danger, only theater. The official tallies later boasted that he competed hundreds of times. Some ancient accounts push the number past 700. Every single appearance was staged as a monumental event, and he compensated himself like a championship athlete. The imperial treasury was forced to pay roughly 1 million sesterces per performance directly into his personal accounts. That fortune was extracted from taxes, squeezed from provinces already stretched to breaking, taken from ordinary citizens who would never benefit from a single coin. The empire hemorrhaged wealth so one man could cosplay as a hero. From where Commodus stood, the adoration seemed genuine. The stadium erupted every time he raised his weapon. The crowd chanted every title he had given himself. They pleaded for mercy on behalf of beaten opponents so he could grant it with a magnanimous wave and look godlike. But anyone who studies the sources understands why the applause never faltered. Soldiers and informants were seated throughout the audience. Every face in those stands knew that one wrong expression could be a death sentence. A visible wince, a look of obvious revulsion, even turning your head at the wrong second. Any of it could be noticed, reported, and punished. So people clapped until their palms were raw and their smiles ached. The senators endured the deepest degradation. Commodus made them sit in the front rows, so close they could feel warm droplets of blood land on their togas. So close they could count every staged blow. These were men who had led armies, administered entire regions of the empire, brokered peace between warring nations. Now they were a captive audience, forced to watch their emperor play dress-up with real swords and rigged victims. They could not leave. They could not object. They could only sit under their ceremonial wreaths and sweat. Survival demanded creativity. Roman historians record that senators began chewing laurel leaves during the performances, clenching them between their teeth to keep their faces in constant motion. If disgust or horror twisted their features, the chewing gave them cover. It was the leaves, not the revulsion, that explained any grimace. Others threw themselves into exaggerated applause, clapping with manic energy to disguise clenched jaws and tight throats. Every movement in those front rows was a survival calculation. How to look entertained while your stomach turned inside out. One performance branded itself into the memory of every senator present. Commodus had an ostrich dragged into the arena. With one theatrical swing, he severed its head. The long neck convulsed, the head hanging by a thread of sinew. Then, still gripping the grotesque trophy, he walked directly toward the senators. He did not say a word. He did not need to. He raised the twitching head and swept his free hand slowly across the row of seated men, drawing an invisible line from the severed neck to theirs. The message required no translation. Your head separates from your body just as easily. Somewhere in the stands, One senator cracked. Nervous, desperate laughter bubbled up out of him, the kind of sound a person makes when horror overwhelms every other response. He tried to smother it behind his hand, but others noticed. That senator did not survive the year. Commodus found reasons to eliminate anyone whose loyalty flickered, and his list of suspects expanded with every performance he gave. His appetite for cruelty did not stop at rigged fights and animal massacres. He treated the arena as a personal workshop for inventing new forms of humiliation and death. Exotic creatures were shipped in from the farthest corners of the empire. Lions, leopards, hippopotamuses, elephants, all paraded into the sand and butchered for the crowd. Sometimes he used custom-designed arrows or specially weighted javelins to showcase his precision. The audience marveled at the accuracy, but the atmosphere was toxic. These were not hunts born from necessity or tradition. They were theatrical killings staged for one man's entertainment. The darkest chapter came when he turned his attention to the people Rome had already forgotten. The city's poorest and most vulnerable citizens, people living with missing limbs, spinal deformities, and other visible disabilities, survived on the margins, begging outside temples and bathhouses. Commodus did not see them as human beings deserving of compassion. He saw raw material. He ordered a group of them seized from the streets and dragged into the amphitheater. To complete the grotesque production, his attendants fastened crude tails to their bodies, lengths of rope or fabric designed to resemble serpents. These people were shoved onto the sand in front of a crowd that had gone completely silent. Then Commodus appeared, once again costumed as Hercules, club raised high. He announced to the stadium that he was about to destroy monsters. There was no contest. There was no resistance. He bludgeoned them one by one, crushing skulls and breaking bodies, while thousands of spectators watched. The crowd understood perfectly that these were ordinary citizens, not mythical beasts. They cheered anyway. They cheered because the alternative was becoming the next body on the sand. When the last swing landed, the arena floor was slick with the blood of people whose only crime was existing in a body Commodus found useful as a prop. Their remains were hauled away. Official accounts praised the emperor's heroic triumph over unnatural creatures. No one in any position of authority dared state the obvious truth. The ruler of the civilized world had beaten defenseless citizens to death in broad daylight and called it mythology. By this point, the Senate had been hollowed out. The population was paralyzed. The image of Commodus as Hercules was no longer decoration or propaganda. It was a threat cast in bronze and repeated on every coin. He operated as though he existed above every human law, a divine force entitled to choose who lived and who died based on nothing but his mood. But the arena, as horrifying as it was, only told half the story. What he performed in front of screaming thousands was grotesque. What happened behind the sealed doors of the imperial palace was worse. Inside those walls, day and night blurred into an endless rotation of feasting, excess, and casual violence. Commodus kept an enormous harem. Ancient writers describe hundreds of companions, men and women, collected from across the empire. Some were slaves, purchased at market. Others were the children of respectable families who had no power to refuse when the emperor's agents came calling. Once they passed through the palace gates, they lost everything. Their autonomy, their dignity, their names. Commodus organized them according to his whims, assigning them roles from mythology, or dressing them in costumes that amused him. They were not partners. They were living furniture. The courtiers who attended his evening gatherings witnessed scenes that would never appear in any official record. Tables sagged under mountains of food, while musicians played and dancers performed beneath flickering torchlight. Commodus drank without restraint. And alcohol did not soften him. It sharpened the cruelty. He would order members of his harem to perform degrading acts in front of the assembled guests, watching faces for any flicker of discomfort. If someone looked uneasy, he filed it away. That person might be the next one humiliated. He took particular pleasure in inverting the power structure. Men who technically held the highest offices in the empire could be reduced to jesters at a single command. One notorious incident involved his own Praetorian prefect, the officer personally responsible for the emperor's safety and the most powerful military figure in the capital. In front of a room full of guests, Commodus ordered this man to strip naked and dance holding small cymbals, rattling and swaying while every eye in the room burned into him. The prefect could not refuse. Refusal was death. So he danced, face flushed with humiliation, while his emperor sat back and laughed. These episodes were not entertainment. They were demolition. If the commander of the emperor's own guard could be turned into a joke on command, what protection did rank or achievement offer anyone else? The lesson was absolute. Title, service, accomplishment. None of it shielded you from the emperor's impulses. One misread expression, 1 second of hesitation, and you could slide from honored guest to broken victim between one course of dinner and the next. The nights often ended in bloodshed. Commodus liked to weaponize uncertainty. Sometimes the final act of an evening banquet was a sudden execution. A slave who had spilled a cup of wine. A messenger who carried unfavorable news. A servant who moved a fraction too slowly. Any of them could be beaten, tortured, or killed right there on the dining room floor, while the remaining guests sat paralyzed, eyes fixed on their plates, praying they would not be singled out next. Then there was his private fascination with the mechanics of dying. It was not enough for him to order death from a distance or stage it in the arena. He developed a deeply personal obsession with opening the human body, with watching life leave flesh in real time. Ancient sources describe him adopting the role of a physician in a grotesque parody of medicine. He would summon a servant, claim he wanted to examine some minor ailment, and then pick up actual surgical instruments. There was never any intention to heal. He made incisions to see what lay beneath the skin. He opened veins to observe the way blood moved. He pressed on fresh wounds to study how the victim reacted, watching the stages of shock and agony with the detached focus of a man studying an insect. Sometimes he prolonged the process, slowing the bleeding to extend the observation. Other times, he grew bored and finished quickly. The outcome was always identical. Another corpse, another experiment concluded. Another layer of dread settling over every person who lived within those marble walls. For anyone who existed in his orbit, the world stopped making sense. The emperor, who called himself Hercules, protector of civilization, was also the man who might open your body with a scalpel after dessert simply because he wanted to watch the light leave your eyes. There was no safe role. Concubine, guard, cook, senator summoned for a private meeting. If his mood was generous, you walked out with a gift. If his mood was dark, you were carried out through the service entrance. At this point, it is worth stepping back. Everything you are hearing draws from ancient biographies, speeches, and historical accounts that most people will never encounter. For this episode, we relied heavily on one modern work in particular, an exhaustive, obsessive investigation into Commodus and his era. That book, the foundation beneath this entire script, is available to you right now. If you tap the View Products button on your screen, you will find it front and center. This is not light reading. It is a relentless archive of imperial madness, a monumental piece of scholarship that goes far deeper than any single video can. If you truly want to understand how a civilization collapses under the weight of one man's delusion, that book belongs on your shelf. And while you are there, do not stop at the main volume. We have assembled a curated collection of objects and relics tied to stories exactly like this one. Immersive pieces of history you can actually hold in your hands. The selection rotates, so I will not spoil what is there now. But if you browse the full collection, you will find items designed to pull you even deeper into these worlds. You will also find our hand-picked list of essential dark history books, chosen to transform your personal library into a serious archive of humanity's most disturbing chapters. Open the shop, explore while you listen, and start building a collection worthy of the stories you are absorbing. Back in Rome, the horrors inside the palace did not stay contained. Secrets bled through the walls, carried by surviving slaves whispering to one another, and shaken courtiers confiding in people they hoped they could trust. The city heard fragments, forced performances, mutilated bodies, screams reverberating through marble corridors deep into the night. Combined with what every citizen had witnessed in the amphitheater, the conclusion was inescapable. This emperor was not merely corrupt or incompetent. He was unraveling, dangerous, and completely beyond prediction. His paranoia swelled in lockstep with his brutality. Every person he degraded and every life he took added another face to the gallery of potential avengers haunting his imagination. He cycled through officials at dizzying speed, elevating favorites into positions of enormous power and then destroying them the moment suspicion flickered. City prefects, praetorian commanders, palace administrators, they rose and crashed in rapid succession. Every downfall came with accusations, sham trials, and frequently executions. Blood ran through the corridors of government as freely as it did through the servant quarters. The Senate had abandoned any pretense of governance. It existed solely to applaud or be punished. Ordinary Romans stopped expecting fairness or stability. They learned to navigate life under a ruler whose temperament could reshape their reality between sunrise and sunset. Some tried to disappear into anonymity. Others tried to profit by reinforcing his fantasies. But beneath every strategy sat the same suffocating certainty. There was no floor. There was no boundary this emperor would not cross. He had converted the amphitheater into his personal stage. He had transformed the palace into a labyrinth of suffering. He had gutted the Senate's authority and conditioned the Roman people to applaud while innocents were murdered in front of them. And yet, something inside him still churned. The terror he generated did not bring him peace, it wound him tighter. Every hushed conversation sounded like conspiracy. Every unfamiliar face triggered suspicion. And when strangers and slaves no longer satisfied the need to crush potential threats, his focus began to shift. There was one group he had not yet fully turned against. One circle of people who shared his blood, who carried his earliest memories, who knew his secrets better than anyone alive. As the paranoia deepened, he stopped seeing them as family. He started seeing them as the most dangerous enemies of all. And when Commodus finally aimed that suspicion at his own relatives, the violence entered its final, most intimate phase. Because the man who had shattered the Senate and numbed an entire population was about to direct his fury at the only people who had ever been close enough to remember the child he once was. And once he began cutting through his own bloodline, the clock counting down to that last night in the bathhouse started ticking for real. When Commodus finally turned his suspicion toward his own family, it did not arrive like a thunderclap. It crept in like rising water. After years of grinding strangers into nothing, after slaughtering the helpless for sport and humiliating the most powerful men in Rome for entertainment, looking across a dinner table at your own blood and seeing an enemy instead of a relative becomes disturbingly easy. The first person to feel that shift was his elder sister, Lucilla. Lucilla had once occupied one of the most enviable positions in the Roman world. Daughter of Marcus Aurelius, widow of a former emperor. At one point in her life, she had technically outranked Commodus himself. But when their father died and her younger brother claimed the throne, she watched the boy she had grown up beside transform into something she barely recognized. She saw the child who demanded a man be burned alive become the emperor who butchered civilians in costume. She heard the whispers from terrified senators and trembling servants, and she arrived at the same conclusion that others were reaching in silence. If nobody intervened, this man would devour the empire from the inside out. Sometime around AD 182, Lucilla threw her weight behind a conspiracy. It was not an elegant operation. It was frantic, clumsy, and born out of desperation. A handful of senators and military officers agreed to strike at Commodus in public. The design was crude. As the emperor entered a theater, a young man would step forward with a blade, shout something about the Senate delivering justice, and kill him before the bodyguards could close the gap. Lucilla and her co-conspirators would then seize control of the Praetorian Guard and steady the empire under new leadership. The assassin choked. He approached Commodus, drew his weapon, delivered his rehearsed line, and then froze. That single heartbeat of hesitation was all it took. Guards swarmed him, wrestled the blade away, and dragged him into custody. Under interrogation, he broke immediately. Names poured out, fellow conspirators, sympathetic senators, and finally, Lucilla. The emperor's own sister had reached for a knife, however indirectly, against a man who believed he was a god, walking the earth. Something fractured inside Commodus that day. He had always been vicious. Now he felt hunted. If the woman who shared his father's blood wanted him dead, then loyalty was a fiction. Lucilla was not executed immediately. First came exile, banished to an island, severed from every connection that had once made her formidable. But exile under a ruler this paranoid is just death with a waiting period. Eventually, the order came. She was killed far from Rome, stripped of influence. Her name turned to ash at court. Commodus had his vengeance, but security did not follow. The opposite happened. The circle of people he was willing to trust contracted to almost nothing. After Lucilla, every woman connected to him by blood fell under the same shadow. Sisters, cousins, noblewomen with any thread of relation to the imperial line were suddenly potential conspirators. Ancient accounts gesture darkly at what followed. Accusations of moral corruption, whispered stories of forced degradation, then silence, death. The specifics are smudged by centuries and propaganda, but the pattern screams through the record. He dragged the women of his own household through scandal and terror, then disposed of them when they no longer served a purpose. Family gatherings in the imperial residence became suffocating, silent affairs. Everyone at the table understood that sharing the emperor's bloodline no longer offered protection. It made you a target. His wife, Brutia Crispina, was not spared. She had been married to Commodus as a political arrangement, a respectable Roman noblewoman whose role was to produce heirs and stand beside him at state ceremonies. Instead, she had a front-row seat to his descent into arena madness and private sadism. Eventually, he turned on her too. The official charge was adultery, the standard accusation Roman emperors reached for when they wanted a wife removed without explanation. Crispina was exiled, most likely to the island of Capri, and subsequently killed. No genuine trial, no opportunity to speak in her own defense, just another person erased to quiet the noise inside his head. As wives and sisters disappeared, Commodus replaced them with concubines. One of them he named after his own dead mother, Faustina. That single detail reveals more about the landscape of his mind than any historian's analysis could. He blurred boundaries that should never have overlapped: mother, lover, possession. He reconstructed the concept of family in a shape he could dominate completely, with no independent thought and no memory of a time when better men held power. Beyond the palace, the killing radiated outward. The Quintili brothers were among the most admired men in Rome, wealthy, accomplished, and genuinely popular. Commodus looked at their reputation and saw a threat. He accused them of conspiracy, sorcery, whatever charges would stick long enough to justify destruction. They were wiped out. Their estates were seized. Their fate became yet another object lesson for the empire. If two of the most respected citizens in Rome could be annihilated on a whim, no one was safe. Paranoia began feeding on superstition. Commodus started seeing danger in omens, coincidences, and even physical resemblances. Men who happened to look like someone he despised were executed simply because their faces triggered his rage. Others were killed for consulting astrologers or owning the wrong texts, as though reading the stars constituted a personal assault on his destiny. Each new killing solved nothing. It only reinforced his conviction that enemies multiplied faster than he could eliminate them. 12 years into his reign, the body count stretched from anonymous slaves at the bottom all the way up to former consuls, wives, and siblings at the top. Meanwhile, the apparatus of government decayed from within. Commodus invested less and less attention in actually ruling. He delegated critical decisions to favorites, men like the Chamberlain Cleander, who auctioned off government positions to the highest bidder and transformed public service into a for-profit enterprise. Corruption bred instability. Food shortages and abuses of power eventually ignited riots in the streets. The mob demanded accountability. To deflect their fury, Commodus sacrificed his own man. Cleander was handed over to the crowd, killed, and his severed head was paraded through the city. The emperor wiped his hands clean as though he bore no responsibility for the conditions that had sparked the violence in the first place. With every crisis, Commodus burrowed deeper into his own mythology. He leaned harder into the Hercules identity, into divinity, into the belief that he was the axis around which civilization revolved. He renamed months. He floated the idea of renaming Rome. He rebranded legions, grain fleets, and state institutions with his personal titles. The more reality destabilized, the more desperately he stamped his name on everything in reach. In his mind, there was only one answer to any problem: more of himself. By the final weeks of AD 192, his fantasies took one last terrifying leap. He was no longer content with arena appearances and divine titles. On January 1st, AD 193, he planned to inaugurate the new year not in the traditional consular robes, but dressed as a gladiator. The most revered civilian office in Roman history was going to be absorbed into his arena persona. His vision was breathtakingly simple. Rome would be governed openly from the sand, by a living god who fought and conquered in front of the cheering masses. Darker rumors circulated alongside the announcement. Some sources claim he intended to execute prominent senators that same day, clearing out the last stubborn pockets of resistance in a single morning of bloodshed. Whether every detail of that plan is accurate matters less than what the people who heard it believed. They had watched Lucilla die. They had seen Crispina vanish. They had felt the weight of a severed ostrich head aimed in their direction. When word reached them that Commodus planned to open the new year as a blood-drenched gladiator consul, many of them quietly assumed they were living their final hours. Which brings us back to the steam curling through that private bathhouse on the last evening of AD 192. In a nearby chamber, 3 people stood over a small wax tablet, staring at words that had just rewritten their futures. Marcia, the concubine who had shared his bed and poured his wine for years. Latus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Eclectus, the chamberlain who managed the inner workings of the emperor's household. On the tablet, in careful handwriting, was a list of names marked for execution at dawn. Their names were on it. All 3. This was not a warning. This was not a negotiation. Commodus was not planning to confront them or test their loyalty. He was planning to have them killed. Publicly or privately, it made no difference. Their existence had become inconvenient, and inconvenient people did not survive in his world. The 3 of them looked at each other and understood one thing with perfect clarity. There was nothing left to discuss. No apology that would land. No favor that could be called in. A man who had executed his own sister over a botched assassination was not going to spare a concubine and 2 administrators out of sentiment. The clock was already running. Marcia was the one with direct access. She knew his rhythms better than anyone alive. She knew that after his bath, he liked to drink, unwind, and drift toward sleep. She knew his blind spots. He trusts me, she understood. It would never occur to him that I could be the danger. Latus controlled the soldiers. Eclectus controlled the keys and the household staff. But physically reaching the emperor while his guard was down, that was Marcia's burden to carry. The decision was made in minutes. There was no time to recruit allies, no time to build a broader coalition. Every additional person who learned the plan was another mouth that could betray them. It would be the 3 of them, a jug of wine, and whatever improvisation the moment demanded. If they failed, if Commodus walked into the new year still breathing, none of them would see another sunset. Marcia moved first. She summoned the servants she trusted most, called for a pitcher of the emperor's preferred wine, and according to the ancient sources, laced it with poison. Not a cautious dose. Enough to drop a powerful man. Enough to kill someone who believed his own body was divine. As she mixed, every memory she carried must have pressed forward. The furnace story. The broken bodies dragged from the arena. The concubines who entered his chambers and never came back out. The servants who screamed while he played doctor with real instruments. Every image was fuel. Every image kept her hands steady. In the bath, Commodus floated in warm water, oblivious. Steam coiled around him. Maybe he was already rehearsing his grand entrance the next morning, imagining the stadium erupting as he stepped onto the sand in consular regalia, redesigned as gladiator armor. Maybe he was picturing the faces of senators as they realized what the new year would bring. He had no idea that just beyond the wall, the one person he considered completely harmless was converting his evening routine into a delivery system for his death. When he emerged from the bath, wrapped in linen, Marcia was waiting with the cup. Calm, practiced. Everything about her posture said this was just another evening, another pour, another decade-long habit playing itself out. She filled the cup without a tremor. If he had caught even a shadow of hesitation in her eyes, he might have reacted. But his arrogance functioned as a blindfold. The emperor who believed he could detect conspiracy from across a room failed to sense the one unfolding inches from his hand. He drank. For a stretch of time, nothing changed. The room continued its usual rhythms. Servants moved through their tasks. Guards held their positions. Marcia withdrew, either unable to watch or needing to coordinate the next stage. Minutes crawled. For a suffocating interval, it looked as though the poison might fail. Then the nausea struck. Commodus began vomiting with violent force, his body fighting the toxin with the resilience of a man conditioned by years of physical training and heavy drinking. His system clawed at survival the way it had been trained to. This was the scenario they had dreaded most. If he recovered and realized what had happened, he would not stop at the three of them. He would tear Rome apart, searching for every person who had ever exchanged a glance with Marcia or whispered a word to Latus. Waiting was no longer an option. They activated the contingency, the plan that left no margin and no ambiguity. They sent for Narcissus, a professional wrestler, a man who had trained alongside Commodus, who had thrown him to the mat in practice sessions, who understood the emperor's physical capabilities better than almost anyone. The conspirators told him what needed to happen. Whether they threatened him, bribed him, or simply described what Commodus had planned for the morning and let the wrestler draw his own conclusions, the sources do not say. They record only what he did. The palace, a building engineered for constant noise and movement, went unnervingly quiet around the emperor's private quarters. Most of the household had no idea what was unfolding. A handful of trusted servants redirected anyone who approached, offering excuses about the emperor feeling unwell and needing rest. Inside the chamber, Commodus lay depleted from the poison and the vomiting. His muscles were unreliable. His awareness was fractured. He was alone with the one variable he had spent his entire reign underestimating. A human being who was close enough to touch him and determined enough to finish the job. Narcissus stepped into the room. Picture the final moments in that cramped, humid space. No Colosseum, no roaring crowd, no elevated platform keeping the emperor safely above danger, no opponents hobbled by chains or armed with useless wooden blades. Just wet marble, bare skin, and two powerful arms locking around the throat of a man who had told the world he was a god. Commodus would have fought, clawing, thrashing, trying to wrench free. But the poison had stolen his strength, the surprise had stolen his preparation, and the wrestler's trained grip did not falter. In the end, the emperor, who had renamed months and cities and legions after himself, could not summon enough air to call for help. The pressure held, the struggle weakened, and the god died, the way every mortal does. For one suspended moment, the Roman Empire had no ruler. A body cooled on the floor of a private room. 3 conspirators and 1 wrestler stood over it, breathing hard, hearts hammering, each of them processing the enormity of what had just happened. They moved fast. The corpse was taken away and prepared in a manner that would support a story of sudden illness. They raced to secure the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, to assemble support in the Senate, to install a successor before rival factions could mobilize. They chose Pertinax, a veteran senator, a former military commander, a man the establishment respected. In the frantic hours between midnight and dawn, they maneuvered him into power. The Senate, stunned but desperate to close the chapter on Commodus, ratified the choice. Statues of the dead emperor were hauled down. His accumulated titles were stripped away. An official damnatio memoriae was proclaimed, a formal condemnation of memory. His name was to be chiseled off inscriptions. Months and cities would revert to their original names. Rome tried to scrub 12 years of madness off its walls like dried blood. But you cannot undo a decade of institutional trauma with a Senate vote and a mason's chisel. The damage had burrowed too deep. The army was fractured. The Senate was hollowed out. The people were conditioned to fear rather than trust. The same Praetorian Guard that had ushered Pertinax onto the throne turned on him within months, murdered him, and then did something unprecedented even by Roman standards. They auctioned the empire to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus purchased the throne like a piece of property at a public sale. The empire spiraled into the violent upheaval historians call the Year of the Five Emperors, as generals across the provinces fought each other for control. Commodus was dead, but the rot he had cultivated was now consuming the structure from within. And Marcia, the woman who had read her own name on a death list and chosen to act instead of wait. She did not emerge as a celebrated liberator. Under Didius Julianus, both she and Eclectus were executed. They had removed a monster from the throne, but they had not escaped the merciless arithmetic of Roman power. The people who help create emperors are almost always consumed when the next wave of ambition crashes through. The woman who freed Rome from 12 years of direct tyranny was swallowed by the same violent current that had drowned countless others before her. In the years that followed, Commodus proved impossible to keep buried. Later emperors, particularly Septimius Severus, selectively rehabilitated his image when it served their political interests. Statues were dismantled, then quietly reconstructed. Historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian set down their accounts, preserving both his atrocities and their revulsion for generations to come. The Damnatio Memoriae failed in the one way that matters most to anyone living today. We still know exactly who he was. So, what do you do with a story like this? A boy, cradled in silk, who orders a man burned alive over the temperature of bathwater. A teenager who absorbs none of his father's philosophy and treats every human life around him as expendable. A ruler who converts the greatest arena in the ancient world into a stage for his rigged delusions, who clubs defenseless people to death while wearing the skin of a mythological hero, who slices open his own servants with surgical tools for the pleasure of watching them die. A man who destroys his sister, discards his wife, erases his relatives, and ultimately forces the people closest to him to choose between waiting for their own murder or committing his. The takeaway is not that Commodus was some kind of supernatural evil. The takeaway is that he was a human being handed absolute power inside a system with no functioning checks. One man's psychological disintegration became government policy, public entertainment, and enforceable law. The palace attendants who faked an execution using wool and animal fat when he was 11 years old were trying to save one life. What they accidentally revealed was a truth the empire would pay for again and again. This child experienced no empathy when another person suffered. And when that child grew up to command armies, treasuries, and courts, the entire Roman world became his furnace room. Absolute power did not transform Commodus into a god. It exposed how hollow he had always been. The man who paraded as Hercules before terrorized crowds died on the floor of his own palace, killed not by a foreign invasion, not by a rival claimant, but by 3 exhausted people who had simply run out of time to keep surviving him. The emperor who renamed the months and the eternal city after himself could not control his own final breath. If you made it through this entire story, thank you. These are not comfortable events to sit with. They are brutal, ugly, and disturbingly real. If you want more history delivered at this depth and with this kind of honesty, subscribe now and hit the like button so you do not miss what comes next. Send this video to someone who still thinks the movie told the whole story, and let them discover how much darker the truth really was. This is Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world, and we will be right here waiting to walk you through the next room.